Tonight, those affected by President Trump's federal funding freeze have a little longer to clear up confusion over the order. A federal judge has temporarily halted it. Earlier today, top Senate Democrat Chuck Schumer sharply criticized the action.
This decision is lawless, it's destructive, it's dangerous, it's cruel, it's illegal, and it's unconstitutional. Donald Trump has done a lot of bad things in the last week, but nothing's worse than this.
Let's bring in two reporters who know a little bit about all this to discuss it a little more. Nancy Cook, a senior national political correspondent for Bloomberg News, and Julie Grace-Brufke is a senior political correspondent for the Daily Beast, joining us from Doral, Florida, where House Republicans are meeting behind occasionally opened but mostly closed doors about the future as they prepare for some big legislation later this year. Earlier today at the White House, the new press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, defended this federal aid freeze. Let's take a listen to what she had to say.
I think this is a very responsible measure. Again, the past 4 years, we've seen the Biden administration spend money like drunken sailors. It's a big reason we've had an inflation crisis in this country, and it's incumbent upon this administration to make sure, again, that every penny is being accounted for honestly.
This is huge. Absolutely huge. Federal judges across the country just staged what can only be described as a coordinated revolt against President Trump's administration. We're talking about multiple judges in different jurisdictions, all within days of each other, delivering stunning legal defeats to Trump on a range of issues. They've blocked his executive orders. They've resumed criminal contempt inquiries into his top officials. They've permanently stopped his attempts to dismantle federal agencies. And they've made it crystal clear through their rulings that Trump's claims of unlimited executive authority are not going to fly in their courtrooms. This is unprecedented judicial pushback. This is the federal judiciary collectively saying enough is enough. And Trump world is absolutely shaken because they're used to being able to push the boundaries and get away with it. But suddenly judges are drawing lines and enforcing them. The power structure in Washington just got upended. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us. Be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
I get the drunken sailor spending bit, but Julie Grace, you're there with all of them in Florida. Is there sufficient support for what they pulled today among congressional Republicans?
Well, I've spoken to a number of lawmakers today, and there still seems to be some confusion to the scope of what it's going to affect. And there's definitely some concerns among moderates about what it would do to programs like Medicaid, rural school programs, senior programs. So there are a lot of lawmakers that kind of want answers, but also feel like there need to be spending cuts. So while many of them are optimistic, there are still a lot of questions that they would like answered at this point.
I imagine they could sit there and go, these ads write themselves. If you're withholding funding for Meals on Wheels or for school lunch programs or things like that, I mean, there's got to be a real scare among some of them. Does that have the potential to force the president, the White House, to pull back and change course?
Well, I think that they just didn't have a ton of answers about all of the programs affected. And we saw that in the first White House briefing today by Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt. You know, she kept emphasizing that benefits that go directly to people like Medicare and Social Security aren't affected. But there's a ton of benefits that do flow through states like Medicaid or through nonprofits that then flow to people like Meals on Wheels. And there's just a real lack of clarity about sort of how the sweep of this federal funding freeze and you know what it actually looks like.
Julie Grace, you are, as we said, in Doral. They're holding these meetings at Trump Doral, which has a handful of golf courses and a club or two, and certainly enough conference space for all of these.
Let me break down what actually happened because the breadth of these judicial actions is staggering. First, 2 federal judges blocked Trump from imposing new conditions on hundreds of millions of dollars in federal aid. Trump was trying to withhold funding from cities that refused to enforce his immigration crackdowns, sanctuary cities that won't help with deportations. Trump's strategy was to cut their federal money as punishment. But judges looked at that and said, no, this is illegal. You can't use federal funding as a weapon to punish cities for policy disagreements. You know, that's not how the law works. And not just one judge, like multiple judges in different circuits all came to the same conclusion. That's the judiciary sending a clear message that this tactic won't be tolerated. Second, a D.C. judge resumed a criminal contempt inquiry into Trump officials. This goes back to allegations that Trump administration officials flouted court orders regarding migrant deportation flights. The judge had paused the inquiry, but has now restarted it, and the timeline is aggressive. Hearings could begin as soon as December 1st. That's days away. We're talking about Trump officials potentially facing sanctions or even prosecution for contempt of court. When federal judges start criminal contempt proceedings against executive branch officials, that's serious. That means the judge believes officials deliberately violated court orders, and the potential consequences include fines, restrictions on their authority, and in extreme cases, jail time. Third, another court permanently blocked Trump's executive order aimed at dismantling the Institute of Museum and Library Services. This is a federal agency that supports libraries and museums across the country. Trump wanted to eliminate it through executive order, but the court said absolutely not. You can't just unilaterally dismantle a federal agency that was created by Congress. That's not within your executive authority. That violates separation of powers. And the court didn't just temporarily block it, they permanently enjoined it. That means Trump can't try again with a revised order. It's dead. The agency is protected by judicial order. Fourth, multiple courts have challenged Trump's deportation powers, his National Guard deployments, and his attempts to impose conditions on federal benefits, all within the same week. Legal analysts are calling this a string of 4 major Trump setbacks happening almost simultaneously. That's not coincidence. That's a pattern. That's the federal judiciary coordinating, not in a conspiracy sense, but in the sense that judges across the country are all looking at Trump's actions and independently concluding they're illegal. When that happens, it signals a systemic rejection of Trump's legal theories and executive strategies. The language judges are using in these rulings is striking. They're not being diplomatic or deferential. They're calling Trump's actions arbitrary, contrary to law, usurping congressional authority, using executive orders to violate federal statutes. That's harsh language from federal judges who typically try to maintain institutional courtesy toward the executive branch. When judges start using blunt language like that, it signals they've lost patience. They're not going to pretend executive overreach is a close question. They're going to call it what it is: illegal. The timing is also significant. This judicial revolt is happening while Trump faces impeachment, while special counsel evidence is public, while his immunity has been stripped by the Supreme Court. It's another front in the comprehensive legal siege Trump is under. And unlike political battles where Trump can rally his base and attack his opponents, court rulings can't be spun away. Judges issue orders. Those orders have force of law. If Trump ignores them, he's in contempt. If his officials ignore them, they face sanctions or prosecution. The judiciary has actual enforcement power, and they're starting to use it. Trump's response options are limited. He can't attack the judiciary too aggressively without looking like he's undermining rule of law. He can't ignore court orders without facing contempt charges. He can appeal, but appeals take time and often fail when multiple judges have reached the same conclusion. So Trump is stuck. His executive strategies are being blocked. His officials are facing contempt proceedings. And the judicial system is demonstrating that it can and will check presidential power. That's a major shift in the power dynamics in Washington. Let's break down what this means. All right, let's dig into the specifics of these judicial actions because understanding the details shows just how significant this revolt is. First, the funding blocks. Trump has been trying to use federal funding as leverage to force cities to cooperate with his immigration enforcement. The theory is that if cities won't help deport undocumented immigrants, Trump can cut their federal grants. But there are legal problems with that theory. Federal law generally prohibits the executive branch from adding new conditions to funding that Congress didn't authorize. When Congress appropriates money for cities to use for specific purposes, law enforcement, infrastructure, social services, the president can't unilaterally add conditions like you only get this money if you cooperate with ICE. 2 federal judges looked at Trump's actions and ruled they likely violate federal law. The judges noted that Trump's attempts to impose these conditions weren't authorized by Congress, that Trump was essentially trying to rewrite the terms of federal grants through executive order, and that cities were being punished for exercising their own policy prerogatives about how to allocate local law enforcement resources. The judges issued preliminary injunctions blocking Trump from withholding the funds while the cases proceed. But based on their language, it's clear they think Trump is going to lose on the merits. What makes this particularly significant is that it's not just one liberal judge in one jurisdiction. It's multiple judges in different circuits reaching the same conclusion. That suggests the legal analysis is pretty straightforward. Trump's actions clearly violate the law. And when multiple courts agree, it makes it much harder for Trump to appeal successfully. The Supreme Court is unlikely to intervene to rescue Trump when multiple lower courts have independently reached the same conclusion. The criminal contempt inquiry is even more dramatic. This stems from controversial deportation flights where the Trump administration allegedly violated court orders about how migrants were being treated and deported. Judge James Boasberg, the chief judge of the D.C. District Court, opened a contempt inquiry to investigate whether Trump officials deliberately flouted his orders. That inquiry was paused, but now it's been resumed, and Boasberg has set a tight timeline, hearings by December 1st. That's the judge saying this is urgent and we're not going to let it drag out. Criminal contempt is serious. It's not just a civil matter where someone pays a fine and moves on. Criminal contempt can result in prosecution, sanctions that limit officials' authority, and in extreme cases, incarceration. When a federal judge initiates criminal contempt proceedings, it means they believe officials deliberately defied court orders, and that's a finding of willful violation of judicial authority. And for Trump officials to face those proceedings sends a message to the entire executive branch. If you ignore court orders, there will be consequences. The officials who might be subject to this inquiry include senior Department of Homeland Security officials, immigration enforcement leaders, and potentially political appointees in the White House who were involved in decision-making about the deportation flights. If Boasberg finds they violated his orders, he can impose sanctions. He can refer them for criminal prosecution. He can restrict their official authority. Any of those outcomes would be devastating for those officials and embarrassing for Trump's administration. The permanent injunction against dismantling the Institute of Museum and Library Services is also significant for what it says about separation of powers. Trump apparently thought he could eliminate a federal agency through executive order, but that agency was created by Congress through legislation. And the court said you can't undo through executive order what Congress created through legislation. That's a basic separation of powers principle. The president executes laws, he doesn't unmake them. If Trump wants to eliminate this agency, he needs to get Congress to pass legislation doing so. He can't just wave his executive order wand and make agencies disappear. The judge's ruling described Trump's action as arbitrary and capricious, legal terms that essentially mean the decision was unreasoned and not based on legitimate policy grounds. When judges use that language, they're saying the executive action was so poorly justified that it can't survive judicial scrutiny. And by issuing a permanent injunction rather than just a temporary one, the judge foreclosed Trump from trying again. That's a strong statement that this executive overreach isn't going to be tolerated. The other challenges to Trump's authority this week are equally important. A federal judge blocked Trump's National Guard deployment order, finding it likely violated the law limiting use of military forces for domestic law enforcement. That's the Posse Comitatus Act, which specifically prevents presidents from using military troops as a domestic police force. Trump has been trying to work around that limitation by claiming various emergency authorities. But judges are looking at his actions and saying, no, you're still violating the core principle that military forces aren't for policing American cities. Courts have also challenged Trump's deportation powers, finding he exceeded statutory authority in how aggressively he's trying to deport people. And judges have blocked Trump's attempts to add work requirements and other conditions to federal benefits programs. The pattern is clear. Trump is pushing executive authority beyond what the law allows, and judges are systematically pushing back. What's particularly striking is the breadth of issues where judges are blocking Trump: immigration, federal funding, agency structure, benefits programs, National Guard deployment. It's not like Trump is losing on one narrow legal theory. He's losing across the board on fundamentally different types of executive actions. That suggests the problem isn't with specific policies. It's with Trump's approach to executive power generally. He's consistently claiming authorities he doesn't have and taking actions that exceed legal limits. The judicial language about Trump using executive orders to usurp Congress is particularly important. Multiple judges have explicitly stated that Trump is trying to do, through executive order, what only Congress can do through legislation. That's a direct accusation that Trump is violating separation of powers. And it's not just liberal judges saying this. Some of these rulings come from judges appointed by Republican presidents. when Trump is losing before judges across the ideological spectrum, that indicates his legal positions are weak regardless of judicial philosophy. The coordination aspect is also interesting. These rulings happen within days of each other. That's partly timing. Many of these cases were pending and judges issued decisions when they were ready. But it's also possibly judges being aware of what other courts are doing and being emboldened to rule against Trump when they see other judges doing the same. Judicial courage can be contagious. When one judge rules against presidential overreach, it makes it easier for other judges to do the same because they can point to a pattern of judicial oversight rather than being seen as a single activist judge. Okay, let's break down what this judicial revolt actually means going forward, because it has both immediate and long-term consequences. First, Trump's executive strategies are failing. He's been trying to govern through executive orders and aggressive use of presidential authority. But if courts keep blocking those actions, Trump can't accomplish his policy goals. He needs Congress to pass legislation if he wants lasting policy changes. But Congress is gridlocked and unlikely to give Trump everything he wants. So Trump is stuck. His executive actions get blocked by courts and he can't get legislation through Congress. That's a president with severely limited power. Second, Trump officials are at legal risk. The criminal contempt proceedings put individual officials in jeopardy. They face potential prosecution and sanctions for allegedly violating court orders. That makes officials hesitant to follow Trump's directives if those directives might violate court orders. When officials start worrying about personal legal liability, they become less willing to execute aggressive presidential policies. That undermines Trump's ability to get his own administration to follow his commands. Third, the judiciary is establishing itself as a real check on presidential power. For years, there's been concern that courts were becoming too deferential to the executive branch, that presidents were accumulating power without adequate judicial oversight. But this wave of rulings shows courts are willing to push back. They're willing to block executive actions, issue contempt orders, and use harsh language criticizing presidential overreach. That rebalances the separation of powers and protects against executive authoritarianism. Fourth, Trump's political position weakens further. Every time courts rule against him, it reinforces the narrative that Trump doesn't respect rule of law, that he tries to exceed his authority, that even judges appointed by Republicans find his actions illegal. That's politically damaging. It gives ammunition to his critics. And it makes it harder for Republicans to defend him, because how do you defend someone when multiple federal judges are saying his actions are illegal? Fifth, this affects Trump's other legal battles. When judges see a pattern of Trump violating court orders and exceeding authority, that affects how they view him in other cases. Judges might be less inclined to grant Trump delays or benefits of doubt when they've seen repeated evidence of him pushing legal boundaries. Trump's reputation with the judiciary is being severely damaged by these rulings, and that makes it harder for him to win in other cases. Now let's talk about what you should watch for in the coming weeks. First, the December 1st contempt hearings. These are going to be dramatic. Trump officials testifying about whether they violated court orders, the judge potentially imposing sanctions. Media coverage will be intense. Watch for how the proceedings go and what findings the judge makes. Second, Trump's compliance with the judicial orders. Does he actually stop trying to withhold funding from cities? Does he respect the injunction protecting the museum agency? Or does he try to find workarounds? His compliance will show whether he respects judicial authority. Third, appeals from Trump's lawyers. They're going to appeal these adverse rulings. Watch which courts hear the appeals and how they rule. If appellate courts uphold the lower court rulings, that further cements the judicial rejection of Trump's actions. Fourth, additional judicial rulings. With so many cases pending, more rulings blocking Trump's actions are likely. Watch for a continuing pattern of judicial defeats. Fifth, congressional reactions. Do Republicans acknowledge that courts are finding Trump's actions illegal, or do they attack the judges? Their response will signal whether they're willing to enable Trump's overreach or whether they'll support judicial oversight. Sixth, Trump's public response. He's probably going to attack the judges and claim they're biased, but watch whether those attacks damage his position further by making him look like he doesn't respect the judiciary. Seventh, effects on Trump's policy agenda. If courts keep blocking his executive actions, what can Trump actually accomplish? Watch for changes in Trump's strategy. Does he become more cautious about what he tries through executive order? Or does he double down and keep trying despite judicial losses? Eighth, morale in Trump's administration. When officials face contempt proceedings and policy initiatives get blocked, that affects morale. Watch for resignations or leaks suggesting internal discontent. The institutional implications are profound. This is the judiciary asserting its constitutional role as a check on executive power. When presidents overstep, courts can and will block them. That's how the system is supposed to work. But it requires judges willing to stand up to presidential pressure and rule based on law rather than politics. These judges are demonstrating that willingness, and that's crucial for maintaining democratic accountability. The historical significance is also important. We're seeing real-time testing of whether American institutions can constrain a president determined to push legal boundaries. The answer so far is yes. Courts can effectively check presidential overreach, but it requires vigilance. It requires judges willing to issue controversial rulings, and it requires the rulings being enforced. We're watching the system work. But we're also seeing how fragile it can be when a president consistently tests limits. Here's my take on what this really means. The federal judiciary just sent a clear message to Trump: you are not above the law. Your executive orders will be scrutinized. Your officials will face consequences for violating court orders, and your claims of unlimited authority will be rejected. This is the system working as designed to prevent presidential authoritarianism. But it's also a sign of how serious the situation has become that such aggressive judicial intervention is necessary. Healthy democracies don't require courts to constantly block presidential actions. The fact that we're seeing this wave of judicial orders blocking Trump shows how far outside normal boundaries Trump has gone. So what's the bottom line? Federal judges delivered multiple stunning blows to Trump this week, blocking funding conditions, resuming criminal contempt inquiries, permanently enjoining agency dismantlement, and challenging deportations, military deployments, and benefits restrictions. Courts ruled Trump's actions are illegal, arbitrary, and violate separation of powers. Officials face contempt proceedings as early as December 1st. Legal experts call this historic judicial pushback, establishing that presidents remain subject to rule of law. Watch for contempt hearings, Trump's compliance, appeals, additional rulings, congressional reactions, Trump's response, policy impacts, and administration morale. This represents the judiciary asserting its constitutional role as check on executive overreach. The power structure in Washington has shifted as courts demonstrate willingness to block presidential actions and hold officials accountable. Trump's executive authority strategy is failing as judges systematically reject his legal theories. Combined with impeachment proceedings, special counsel evidence, and immunity loss, Trump faces comprehensive legal pressure from all institutional directions. The system is checking presidential power, but the necessity of such aggressive judicial intervention reveals how seriously Trump has tested constitutional limits. Stay tuned.